Hi folks, Lorraine Smith here again for take 2 of the TD Materiality Assessment Introduction. Why take 2? I got a little feedback from a few folks that my take 1 that took us through slides that look like this, and even this, was a little bit complicated. So I'm going to offer a very simplified version of this assessment, and there's lots more information online if you want to keep digging for more complexity. To start off, I'll clarify what is a materiality assessment. It's a variation on a traditional assessment, spelled a little differently. I've added reality to materiality so that environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, as I'll refer to it in this conversation, is more useful and helps a company see their role in the future. In fact, the one question that my version of materiality assessments seeks to answer is, does this company belong in the future we want? And I try to answer that question based on publicly available disclosures from the company, conversations with stakeholders, and some of my own analysis and experience from a couple decades in ESG thinking, doing, assessing, and strategizing. So there's lots more details in the full assessment. The footnotes and links, etc., are available in those deeper slides, and I'll make some of those links available here in the show notes as well. So let's get started. At the beginning of the assessment, I include a letter to TD Bank. I offer a couple extracts from that letter. The first is just to explain my purpose, which is to foster the shift to a regenerative economy. And by that, I really mean that every company within every industry is part of a healing movement. It is part of industrial healing. I think we have a long way to go to be there, but I think it's not only possible, it's necessary. And so to get there, I offer some ideas about what could be different and what could be better. That's really my intention here. I chose TD for this assessment out of all the banks in the world because I'm a customer. I've been a customer of TD Bank for most of my life. And I've never worked with them in a formal commercial setting, although I've worked with a lot of other companies around the world, including a couple banks. So I decided to go with the company that I'm a customer of, that I don't have a commercial relationship with. Lots more in that letter, but moving on into the assessment itself, I start out by looking at a company's purpose. And in the case of TD Bank, their purpose is to enrich the lives of their customers, their communities, and their colleagues. That's a pretty worthy purpose, and they also offer pretty useful, what you call basic profile information about how they go about doing that, how big they are, where they operate, that kind of thing. And no big surprises there in terms of a major global financial services company. But when we compare their purpose to what they actually do, that's where materiality starts to show perhaps some opportunities for transformation and or at least deeper understanding. So sure, in a strictly financial sense, they do enrich some customers and some employees. But as a lot of stakeholders highlighted, and I saw with my own eyes, at a broader sense, they are contributing to putting us at a sense of collective peril. And not everybody is being enriched by this. So I'll take us through 4 of the key findings of the assessment. There's a lot more you could dig into if you'd like. The first one is just the basics of the disclosures. So imagine if these were in really simple plain English about how the money came in and what they did with it when it went out. That would be great. That is not the case, although they do offer pretty straightforward financial metrics, as any bank does, and they're of course regulated to do. When you start to line up the ESG disclosures and you ask a very basic question, of the $1.8 trillion that the company has in assets, what percentage of it is green? Or you could insert other numbers. How much are they putting towards sustainable finance, etc.? Versus how much is going towards activities that we know are accelerating climate change, are contributing to inequality and other very serious social crises. And when we line up their various reports, their ESG report, their annual reports, their TCFD, or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, etc., including what they say to their investors, it's actually impossible to answer that question. Very simple question. What percentage is going towards the future we want versus the future we don't want? We don't know. However, we can make some pretty concrete conclusions. So one thing that I would look for is the company financing activities that restore ecosystems and biodiversity? Is it financing healthy communities and healthy people? And although, of course, they have lots of wonderful initiatives going on, and by the way, although we're talking about TD Bank here, we could be talking about many banks, most banks, I would say. But I'm using very specific examples to make the point of what needs to change. Because although they have a lot of lovely initiatives and nice things they can say, they continue to contribute billions towards what is causing mass extinction and fueling inequality. As I said, there are a lot of details and links in the full analysis. Let's just take a snapshot of one piece. I compared an annual report of TDs from 10 years ago to their most recent. So a decade on. In some cases, they have doubled transactions into fossil fuels and trebled into financing of mining. Those are two industries that are directly contributing to very serious environmental and therefore human challenges. So although we can't get one simple number of how much is going towards the future we want versus undermining it, we can actually see some pretty straightforward numbers to notice they are increasing the amount of capital flowing towards things that need to end rather quickly. What's another finding? Well, let's imagine if this company embraced a worldview of caring for Mother Earth, which, by the way, would make that previous finding a moot point. It just wouldn't be happening. What would it look like if the worldview of the company, of the way it operated, was reflective of the mindset and the worldview of Indigenous peoples, instead of thinking of First Nations as a sort of topic around diversity and inclusion for an ESG report? Well, in fact, at the moment, they are a topic. They're sort of lumped in with the diversity and inclusion conversation. Their most recent ESG report, there are 71 mentions of the word Indigenous, but really it's very sort of listy and checkboxy. It's as if the idea was to say, there is no complete erasure going on here. We see Indigenous peoples, but beyond seeing and listing them as a topic with a few topical initiatives, it is quite superficial and rote. Whereas, as one stakeholder put it, this is an opportunity to really listen, to learn from First Nations, from Indigenous peoples from around the world. What is it like to live in right relation to the land, in right relation to our communities? What have we lost, and what can we learn? And then the last key finding I'll mention here is around employees and payment. So, of course, in a world where we are truly restorative and our economy is regenerative, we are paid well and fairly. And at the moment, the top layer at the bank is really paid what can only be described as excessively high wages. Again, this is not unique to TD Bank, but let's take a close look here. So the CEO actually took a $2 million pay cut, but due to the pandemic. But let's just note that pay cut is still nearly 38 times the average Canadian's earning. That was the cut, not the pay itself, which remains exorbitantly high. And in the words of one stakeholder who was a former high income earner at TD Bank and worked there for a number of decades, basically said the top 2,000 people are paid too much for the work that they do. So switching to what the executives themselves are saying to investors, I provide a fair bit of detail on some of the investor earnings calls that happen every quarter. The transcripts are public. Anybody can have a look. So I'm just lifting out one data point here so we can unpack it a little bit, because I can hear the pushback a bit. Come on, Lorraine, they're trying to do things and they are doing a lot, right? And there's a lot of money flowing around. Okay, well, let's have a look. So in their Q1 earnings call from 2022, from this year, there was talk of the $500 million green bond that was offered by TD Bank in collaboration with other partners to underwrite it. And this was put further in the context of it being a record quarter in terms of these kinds of deals. So, okay, $500 million is a lot. Let's see what that really looks like, though, when we peel back a layer. First of all, I flinch a little bit when these kinds of mentions of ESG-related topics are just kind of munched in I'm going to say, a kind of slotted in generic messaging way. And the clue for me is that it's embedded with the same paragraph as charitable giving and grant giving as this was. So it just felt a little rote to me. It's separate from the core business. But the far more important thing, frankly, the order of when what gets said is not that important to me. What really got me quite concerned is when I looked more closely at the sustainable bond framework. And again, not unique to TD Bank, but nonetheless, this is where these $500 million were determined to meet their criteria. And when you look closely at the framework, it is clear that in order to be earmarked as a sustainable bond, or what gets called a green bond, or sometimes climate-aligned bond, these are not proceeds that are necessarily creating net positive, restorative, healing activities. Far from it. They may be less bad, they may be a greener alternative, but they are, as far as I could tell, not required to be truly restorative, which is, in my humble opinion, absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we're just going in the wrong direction a little less quickly. And given that it was a record quarter, we're going in the wrong direction at a record pace. It just doesn't work. Even if you want to push back even harder and say, no, but still, Lorraine, these are relatively positive things. Although I just gave you reasons why I don't think that's true, if it is true, this is, in this record quarter, about 1% of the deals that were done. So what about the other 99%, the vast majority? I talked to a range of stakeholders from different perspectives who are not from inside the bank, and I asked them to provide a ranking where +5 would be contributing to the future they want, which I also asked them to describe, and truly creating that future in a very proactive way. -5 would be undermining that future. And obviously there's a range everywhere in between. I asked them to think about that in terms of ecosystem health as well as societal health on the horizontal here. So vertical is ecosystem, horizontal is societal. This is a gross oversimplification of very complex dynamic factors, which I made clear. It is in reaction to the typical ESG materiality matrix, which plots issues, whereas I've asked stakeholders here to plot the company itself. Where are they in terms of creating the future we want? And the most important thing here is not the numerical result, because we know that that's a little bit specious. It's too simplified for a complex conversation. More important is, why do they give it that ranking? And stakeholders had really interesting things to say. As you can see, these bubbles that have come up here show that stakeholders actually varied quite dramatically in terms of where they would place the bank. Some see them as genuinely contributing to the future we want. The majority are leaning towards not contributing, in fact, undermining, and all were reluctant to say that they're contributing in any sort of knocking it out of the park way. I'd like to highlight a couple things here. One is that if you go to the live assessment, which is available, anybody can click around in there, these bubbles are actually representative of the stakeholders. You can click on them and go and see the videos, listen to the audios, or read the transcripts. So you don't have to take my word for the analysis. You can draw your own conclusions. You can dig a little deeper because, of course, even if you agree with my conclusions, there's a lot of details here that are just not mashed into even my more complicated slides. Something else that I think is really important for materiality based in reality is the pursuit of perspective from the non-human world. And so there are a couple bubbles here that represent stakeholder perspective from what we might just call nature. And I propose a way to do that. I'm experimenting and learning as I go. This is the second assessment. I took a run at it with the first one as well. I really welcome your perspective on this, both on the interviews as they've been conducted so far, but also on, well, what would you find if you asked the river that runs through the city where you live, if you asked the mountains that you see in the distance, if you asked the trees that have been growing in the park nearby to your home, how they see TD contributing to the future they want? What kind of answers do you think you might hear? So again, very experimental, but that's what's going on with the matrix in an effort to really understand if this company belongs in the future, and if not, what would need to change. So on that note, on what could change, that might be having simple, plain English disclosures that anybody can understand about where the money is coming from and where it's going. And that those disclosures would show this is a company that only finances activities that restore ecosystems and biodiversity, that create healthy people in healthy societies. That is where the money goes. That's because the bank has embraced a worldview that really considers Mother Earth as our main home. We care for her and the communities that she upholds, something that reflects how our Indigenous friends and neighbors have been living for millennia. And finally, of course, that people are paid fairly and reasonably. Those are just 4 very summarized ideas that came from the assessment and that I believe could be part of TD fulfilling its purpose of enriching the lives of customers, communities, and colleagues. You can find out a lot more. I've written fairly detailed articles about this assessment and other elements of materiality, all available on my Medium page. On my YouTube channel, these stakeholder interviews, as well as other assessments of materiality and more details on the methodology itself, are available. And on SoundCloud, many of these are also available just as audios if you prefer that type of listening. So I hope you'll have a look and give it a closer examination. On my website, there's a whole page dedicated to materiality with all of the links available. So lots of these things cross-reference if you're trying to find more information. And then for now, I just thank you for coming along on this journey, on this simplified look at the summary of TD Bank's materiality assessment. I hope you found it helpful. And if you have, feel free to kick a little support into the tip jar that you'll find on my website. Thanks so much. Really appreciate any feedback, questions, or ideas you might have about what comes next. Cheers.